I was making coffee on a Saturday morning when I heard crying outside my front door. Not normal crying, but the desperate wailing of an infant. And my first thought was that one of my neighbors needed help. Maybe their baby was sick. Maybe there was an emergency. So I rushed to the door, still in my bathrobe, my hair not even brushed yet. And when I opened it, there was no neighbor standing there asking for help. There was a car seat sitting on my porch with a baby inside, maybe 3 or 4 months old, screaming at the top of tiny lungs. And pinned to the blanket covering the car seat was a note written in unfamiliar handwriting that said just 4 words: "Ask your husband." And in that moment, standing there in my doorway, looking down at this crying baby, with those 4 words burning into my brain, I realized that my entire marriage, the 27 years I'd spent with my husband James, the life we'd built together, the trust I'd given him completely and without question, all of it might have been built on a lie. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story from. I want to know how far it's traveled, because what started with a baby on my porch turned into a journey of discovery that revealed secrets I never imagined, lies that went back decades, and a truth so devastating it changed everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the man I'd loved for nearly 3 decades. My name is Patricia. I'm 52 years old, and until that Saturday morning, I thought I had a good marriage. Not perfect, no marriage is, but good, solid, built on trust and history and shared experiences. James and I met when we were in our early 20s at a church picnic in Atlanta. I was working as a bank teller, and he was just starting out as a contractor. And we hit it off immediately. He was charming and funny, and he made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the room. We dated for 2 years, got married in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends, and built what I thought was an honest life together. We had 2 children, Marcus, who's now 25 and working as a software engineer in California, and Keisha, who's 23 and teaching elementary school right here in Atlanta. They're good kids. We raised them right, taught them about integrity and honesty, and treating people with respect. And I was proud of the family we'd built, proud of the life James and I had created together. James and I had our struggles like any couple. There were times when money was tight, when his contracting business wasn't doing well, when we argued about bills or the kids, or whose turn it was to deal with his mother, who lived with us for the last 5 years of her life before she passed away 3 years ago. But we always worked through it. We always came back to each other. We always chose our marriage and our family. And I trusted him completely, trusted that he was faithful, trusted that he told me the truth about where he was and what he was doing, trusted that we were partners in every sense of the word. And now, standing on my porch, looking down at a baby that clearly wasn't mine, with a note telling me to ask my husband, I felt that trust crumbling, felt everything I believed about my marriage, about James, about my life, starting to crack and shatter. I picked up the car seat, my hands shaking, and brought it inside. The baby was still crying, that desperate cry that means hungry or wet or both. And I went into autopilot mode, the way you do when you've raised 2 kids. I checked the diaper, which was soaked, and found a diaper bag tucked beside the baby in the car seat, with diapers and formula and a few changes of clothes. I changed the baby. It was a little girl with beautiful brown skin and these big dark eyes that looked up at me while she cried. And I found myself talking to her softly, saying, "It's okay, baby, it's okay. We'll figure this out," even though I had no idea what this was or how we were going to figure anything out. I made a bottle, the way I remembered from when my kids were babies, and the baby girl took it eagerly, drinking like she hadn't eaten in hours. And as she ate, she calmed down, her eyes starting to droop with exhaustion. And I sat there in my living room, holding this stranger's baby, feeding her, and looking at that note over and over again. Ask your husband. What did that mean? Was this James's baby? Was I holding my husband's child from an affair? And if so, who was the mother? Why had she left the baby here? Why now? After what must have been months of this child being alive? James wasn't home. He'd left early that morning, saying he had to check on a job site that his crew had been working on all week and wouldn't be back until evening, which gave me hours to sit with this baby and this note and these terrible thoughts spinning through my mind. I tried to think rationally, tried to come up with other explanations. Maybe this was someone's idea of a cruel joke. Maybe the baby, the overall tone should be a relative. Maybe there was some misunderstanding, but the note was pretty clear. Ask your husband. It implied that James had answers, that James knew something about this baby that I didn't. And the more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. Because if James had fathered this baby, that meant he'd cheated on me. And not just cheated, but gotten someone pregnant and hidden it from me for an entire pregnancy and months afterward. And what else had he hidden? What else didn't I know? The baby fell asleep in my arms, and I laid her down on the couch, surrounded by pillows, so she wouldn't roll off. And I went to find my phone with shaking hands. I pulled up James's contact, and I almost called him, almost demanded answers right then. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of what he'd say. Maybe it was the need to process this myself first. Maybe it was the small hope that there was some innocent explanation. And calling him at work screaming accusations would damage something that didn't need to be damaged. So instead, I took photos of the baby, of the note, of everything in the diaper bag, looking for clues, for anything that would tell me who this child was and where she'd come from. In the diaper bag, there were about 10 diapers, 3 outfits in size 3 to 6 months, 4 bottles of formula, already mixed and ready to use, a pacifier, and a small stuffed elephant. But there was nothing with a name, no paperwork, no birth certificate, no note beyond the one pinned to the blanket, no identification at all, just baby supplies, and a child who couldn't tell me who she was or where she came from. I went through everything twice, hoping I'd missed something, but there was nothing, and I felt this growing panic because what was I supposed to do with this baby? I couldn't just keep her. I couldn't just act like this was normal, like babies got left on porches every day with cryptic notes. But I also couldn't call the police. Not yet. Not until I knew what was happening. Not until I talked to James. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, taking care of this baby, who'd been literally left on my doorstep. She woke up after an hour, needing another diaper change and another bottle. And I did it all mechanically, going through the motions, while my mind raced with questions and fears and worst-case scenarios. I tried to see James in her features, tried to determine if she looked like him, or like our kids when they were babies. But it was hard to tell. Babies change so much in their first. And this little girl could have been anyone's child. Or she could have been James's daughter, my husband's secret child from an affair I knew nothing about. Around noon, I called my sister Lorraine, who lives about 20 minutes away, and I asked her to come over. Told her I needed to talk. Told her something had happened and I needed advice. And Lorraine, being Lorraine, didn't ask questions, just said she'd be right there. And 40 minutes later, she was standing in my living room, looking down at the baby, who was sleeping peacefully in the car seat, completely oblivious to the chaos she'd caused. And Lorraine said, "Whose baby is that?" And I handed her the note and watched her face change as she read it, watched her eyes go wide and her mouth drop open, and she said, "Patricia, what the hell is going on?" "I don't know," I said. "That's the problem. I have no idea whose baby this is, or why she was left on my porch, or what James knows about it. But someone clearly thinks he has answers." And Lorraine sat down heavily on my couch and said, Do Do you think James cheated on you? Do you think this is his baby? And I said, I don't know, Lorraine. I don't know anything right now, except that there's a baby on my couch and a note telling me to ask my husband, and I'm terrified of what he's going to say when I do. Lorraine and I spent the next hour talking through possibilities. Maybe the baby belonged to someone in James's family. Maybe it was his brother's kid or his cousin's kid, and they were in trouble and needed help and had left the baby with us temporarily. But that didn't explain the note. Why would family leave a note like that? Why not just call and explain the situation? Maybe James had helped someone. Maybe he'd loaned money to a woman in trouble, and now she was asking him to help more by taking care of her baby. But again, the note didn't make sense. If it was just about asking for help, why be so cryptic? Why not explain? We went round and round, but nothing made sense. Nothing explained why a baby would be abandoned on my porch with a note implying my husband knew exactly why. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone rang, and it was James, saying he was done at the job site and asking if I needed him to pick anything up on the way home. And I almost told him right then, almost said, "Get home now, we need to talk. There's a situation." But I couldn't do it over the phone. I needed to see his face, needed to watch his reaction when I showed him this baby and that note. So I just said, "No, come." Straight home, and he said, "Okay, see you soon, love you." And I said, "Love you too," even though the words felt hollow, felt like they might be based on lies I'd believed for 27 years. James got home around 4:30, and I heard his truck pull into the driveway, heard his footsteps on the porch, and I was sitting on the couch with the baby in my arms because she'd woken up crying again, and I'd fed her and changed her, and now she was just looking around with those big dark eyes, taking in her surroundings. And when James walked through the door, he was smiling, calling out, "Hey, honey, I'm home." But then he saw me sitting there with the baby, and his smile froze, and his face went pale, and I watched all the color drain from his face, and I knew right then that he recognized this baby, that he knew exactly who she was and why she was here. James dropped his keys on the floor and just stood there, staring. And I said, "James, whose baby is this?" And he opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And I said, "I found her on the porch this morning. There was a note. It said to ask you. So I'm asking you, James, whose baby is this? And why was she left on our porch?" And he still didn't answer, just kept staring at the baby like he'd seen a ghost, like his worst nightmare had just materialized in his living room. And I stood up, holding the baby, and I walked over to him, and I said, "Answer me, James, right now. Who is this child?" And James finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. And he said, "Patricia, I can explain." And I said, "Then explain, James. Explain to me why there's a baby on my couch. Explain to me why someone left her here with a note telling me to ask you. Explain to me why you look like you've seen a ghost." And James took a deep breath and said, "Can we sit down? This is complicated." And I said, "No, James, we're not sitting down. You're going to tell me right now whose baby this is." And he looked at me, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. And he said, "She's mine, Patricia. She's my daughter." The room started spinning, and I felt like I might pass out. I handed the baby to James, more like shoved her into his arms, because I couldn't hold her anymore, couldn't look at her without seeing evidence of my husband's betrayal. And I backed away from him, my hand over my mouth, and I said, "When? When did you have an affair? When did you father this child?" And James was crying now, holding his daughter awkwardly, like he wasn't sure what to do with her. And I said, "Patricia, it's not what you think. It wasn't an affair. It was." And he stopped, and I screamed at him. "It was. James, tell me right now, what was it? James sat down, still holding the baby, and he said, "It was one night, about a year ago. I was working late on a project downtown, and I stopped at a bar for a drink. And I met a woman, and we talked, and I had too much to drink. And she and we made a mistake, one night, Patricia, one terrible mistake that I've regretted every day since." And I stared at him, this man I'd been married to for 27 years, this man who'd stood in a church and promised to be faithful, who'd raised 2 children with me, who'd shared my bed and my life and my trust. And I said, "You cheated on me." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "You got another woman pregnant?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "And you never told me?" And he said, "No, Patricia, I didn't tell you, because I didn't know she was pregnant. I never heard from her again after that night. I thought it was just a terrible mistake that I could forget and move on from. I had no idea there was a baby." I felt like I was going to be sick. I ran to the bathroom and threw up everything in my stomach. And then I sat on the cold tile floor with my back against the wall, trying to process what James had just told me. My husband had cheated on me, had a one-night stand with some woman in a bar, had created a child, and for a year he'd kept it secret. And now that child was in my house. And I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to feel, didn't know if I could ever look at James the same way again. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually there was a knock on the bathroom door, and it was Lorraine saying, "Honey, let me in." And I unlocked the door, and she came in and sat on the floor next to me and put her arm around me, and I cried. I cried like I hadn't cried in years, big, heaving sobs that shook my whole body. And Lorraine just held me and let me cry. Didn't say it would be okay, didn't make empty promises, just sat with me in my pain. Eventually, I pulled myself together enough to ask, "Where's James?" And Lorraine said, "He's in the living room with the baby. He's been trying to call the mother, but her number's disconnected. He doesn't know where she is or why she left the baby here." And I said, "Good. Let him figure it out. Let him deal with the consequences of his choices. I can't. I can't even look at him right now." Lorraine helped me up, and we went to the guest bedroom, and I laid down on the bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how my life. The overall tone should be a mature, rich, and heartfelt narration, carrying the weight of deep betrayal and disappointment. Had fallen apart in the span of a few hours this morning. I'd woken up thinking I had a good marriage, thinking I knew my husband, thinking my life was stable and predictable. And now, everything was chaos. There was a baby in my house, a baby that was James's daughter, which made her my what? Stepdaughter, I guess? Though that word didn't seem right for a child who'd been conceived through infidelity. And James had cheated on me, had broken our vows, had created a whole other life, literally. And I didn't know if I could forgive that, didn't know if I wanted to try. Lorraine stayed with me for hours, and eventually I fell asleep, exhausted from crying, from processing, from trying to figure out what to do next. And when I woke up, it was dark outside, and I could hear voices downstairs. I got up and walked to the top of the stairs, and I could hear James talking to someone on the phone, his voice desperate, saying, "Please, if you know where she is, if you know how to reach her, I need to talk to her. She left our daughter here, and I don't know what to do." I went downstairs, and James was sitting on the couch with the baby asleep in his arms, and he looked up at me and said, "Patricia, I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything right now, but I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to hurt you." And I said, "But you did, James. You did hurt me. You broke my trust. You broke our vows. You created a child with another woman and kept it secret for a year. And now that child is here, and we have to figure out what to do?" And James said, I know, and I'm trying to find her mother. I'm trying to figure out why she left the baby here, why she didn't tell me about the pregnancy, why?" And I cut him off, saying, "I don't care about why right now, James. What I care about is what we're going to do. Are we calling child services? Are we calling the police? What are we doing with this baby?" James looked down at the sleeping infant in his arms and said, "She's my daughter, Patricia. I can't just hand her over to strangers. I have to take responsibility for her." And I felt this surge of anger and said, "Oh, now you want to take responsibility? Now, after she's been dumped on our porch? What about taking responsibility when you were in that bar? What about taking responsibility when you were sleeping with another woman? What about taking responsibility for your marriage, for your vows, for me?" And James just shook his head and said, "You're right. You're absolutely right. I should have been responsible. I should have. I had been faithful. I failed you, Patricia. I failed our marriage. But this baby, she didn't ask for any of this, and I can't abandon her the way her mother apparently has." We sat there in tense silence for a long time, and finally I said, "I need some time, James. I need to think about all of this. I need to figure out if I can, if I even want to stay in this marriage after what you've done." And he nodded and said, "I understand, Patricia. I'll do whatever you need. I'll give you space. I'll sleep in the guest room. I'll—" And I said, "No, James, you're not sleeping in the guest room. You're leaving. You're going to stay with your brother or at a hotel or wherever, but you're not staying here. Not tonight." And James looked like I'd slapped him, but he nodded and said, Okay, I'll go. But Patricia, the baby, someone needs to take care of her." And I said, "You figure it out, James. You created this situation. You deal with it." And I walked upstairs to our bedroom and closed the door and locked it, and lay down on our bed that suddenly felt too big, too empty, and I cried myself to sleep for the second time that day. I woke up the next morning to my phone ringing. It was early, maybe 6 a.m., and I saw it was Marcus, my son, calling from California. And I answered, and he said, "Mom, what's going on? Dad called me last night, and he was really upset. Said something happened, and you kicked him out." And I sat up in bed, trying to figure out what to tell my son, how much to tell him. And finally, I said, "Marcus, your father cheated on me about a year ago, and there's a baby, his baby, that was left on our porch yesterday." And there was silence on the other end. And then Marcus said, What? He cheated on you? And there's a baby, Mom? Mom, are you okay? Do you need me to come home?" I told Marcus no, I didn't need him to come home, that I needed to figure this out on my own, but I appreciated the offer. And we talked for a while, and Marcus was angry, furious actually, that his father had done this, had betrayed me, had created this situation. And he said, "Mom, whatever you decide, I support you. If you want to leave him, if you want to work it out, whatever you decide, I'm on your side." And that meant more to me than he probably knew, because I felt so alone, so isolated in this nightmare that had become my life. After I hung up with Marcus, I called Keisha and told her the same thing. And her reaction was different. She cried and asked how this could happen, asked if there was anything she could do, asked if I was sure. About everything. And I said, "Yes, honey. I'm sure there's a baby downstairs." And your father admitted she's his daughter. And Keisha said, "I can't believe he would do this. I can't believe Dad would cheat on you, would lie to you, would—" And she started crying harder. And I found myself comforting her, even though I was the one who'd been betrayed, even though I was the one whose world had fallen apart. I spent most of Sunday in my room. I didn't want to deal with James, didn't want to deal with the baby, didn't want to deal with any of it. I just wanted to hide and pretend none of this had happened. But around noon, Lorraine came over and knocked on my bedroom door and said, "Patricia, you need to eat. You need to take care of yourself." And I said, "I don't want to eat, Lorraine. I just want to be left alone." And she said, "Tough. You're coming downstairs and you're eating something, and then we're going to talk about what you're going to do, because you can't just hide up here forever." Lorraine was right, of course. So I went downstairs and found James sitting at the kitchen table with the baby in a portable bassinet next to him. And he looked terrible. He clearly hadn't slept. His eyes were red and puffy, and he had stubble on his face. And he was just staring at the baby like he couldn't quite believe she was real. Lorraine made me sit down and eat some toast and eggs while she grilled James, asking him about the baby's mother, about what he'd been trying to find her, about what his plans were. And James explained that her name was Nicole, that he'd met her at a bar called the Blue Room downtown, that they'd talked for hours, and he'd felt this connection. And he knew it was wrong, knew he was married, but he'd had too much to drink and his judgment was impaired. And one thing led to another, and they ended up at her apartment. And he'd left the next morning feeling guilty and ashamed, and had never contacted her again. And apparently she'd never tried to contact him either. Until now, until she'd left their daughter on our porch with that note. James said he'd been trying to find Nicole. He'd gone back to the Blue Room, but nobody there knew who she was or how to contact her. He'd tried to remember her last name, but realized he'd never asked. He'd tried to remember where her apartment was, but it had been dark and he'd been drunk, and he couldn't recall the address. He had no way of finding her, no way of asking her why she'd left the baby, why she hadn't told him about the pregnancy, why she just disappeared. And Lorraine looked at him with disgust and said, "So you slept with a woman whose last name you didn't even know? And you expect Patricia to just forgive you and move on?" And James said, "No, I don't expect that. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't know what to do." The situation was impossible. James had a daughter from an affair, a daughter who'd been abandoned with us, and we didn't know what to do. We couldn't just keep her like she was a stray cat that had wandered onto our porch, but we also couldn't just hand her over to child services without trying to find her mother, without understanding what was happening. I said to James, "We need to file a police report. We need to let them know that a baby was abandoned here. Let them investigate and find the mother." And James said, "But Patricia, what if they take the baby? What if they put her in foster care? What if?" And I cut him off saying, "Then that's what happens, James. This baby is not our responsibility. She's yours, maybe, but she's not mine. I didn't create her, I didn't cheat, I didn't lie, and I'm not going to be forced to care for the evidence of your infidelity." Lorraine nodded and said, "Patricia's right. You need to file a police report. This isn't something you can just handle privately." And James reluctantly agreed. And that afternoon, we went to the police station, all three of us, plus the baby, and we filed a report about the abandonment. The officers took statements, took photos of the note and the baby and the car seat, and they said they'd investigate. But these cases were complicated, that if the mother didn't want to be found, she could be very hard to locate. And in the meantime, we needed to decide what to do with the baby. Did we want her placed in temporary foster care, or did we want to take care of her ourselves while the investigation continued? James immediately said he'd take care of her, that she was his daughter, and he wasn't going to let her go into foster care. And I said, "Fine, James, you take care of her, but you're not doing it at my house. You can stay with your brother, you can get your own place, you can do whatever, but you're not bringing her back to my home." And James looked at me with these pleading eyes and said, "Patricia, please, she's just a baby. She didn't ask for any of this." And I said, "I know she didn't, James, but I didn't ask for this either. I didn't ask to have my marriage destroyed. I didn't ask to have evidence of your affair show up on my doorstep. And I'm not going to pretend everything's fine. I'm not going to play house with your daughter from another woman." And the officer taking our statement looked uncomfortable. and said, "Folks, maybe you should discuss this at home. This is a private family matter." And I said, "No, officer, this isn't private anymore. The moment that baby got left on my porch, it became public." We left the police station and drove back to my house in silence. And when we got there, James packed a bag, took the baby and all her supplies, and said, "Patricia, I'm going to stay with my brother for now. But we need to talk. We need to figure out our marriage." And I said, "I don't know if there's anything to figure out, James. You cheated on me. You broke my trust. And I don't know if I can ever forgive that." And he said, "I understand. But please, just don't make any permanent decisions yet. Please, give me a chance to prove to you that I can be better." And I didn't answer, just watched him load the baby into his truck and drive away. The house felt empty after James left. Empty and quiet and wrong. I'd lived in this house for 20 years, had raised my children here, had built a life here, and now it felt like a museum of a marriage that no longer existed. I walked through the rooms, looking at photos of James and me, at our kids' graduations, at vacations, at anniversaries, and I wondered how many of those smiling photos were lies. How many times had James been thinking about Nicole, thinking about that night, thinking about the mistake he'd made, while I was blissfully ignorant, thinking our marriage was solid. I called my pastor, Pastor Wilson, who'd married James and me 27 years ago, and I asked if I could meet with him. And he said, "Of course, come by the church tomorrow morning." And the next day, I went and sat in his office and told him everything about the baby, about James's confession, about feeling like my entire marriage had been built on a lie. And Pastor Wilson listened quietly, and when I finished, he said, "Patricia, I'm so sorry you're going through this. Infidelity is one of the deepest betrayals a spouse can experience, and your feelings are completely valid. But I want to ask you something. Do you want to save your marriage, or do you want to end it?" I said, "Honestly, Pastor, I don't know. I'm so angry. I'm so hurt. I don't know if I can ever trust James again. But we've been married for 27 years. We have children and grandchildren someday. We've built a whole life together. And I don't know if I can just throw that away. But I also don't know if I can stay. Married to someone who could betray me like this." And Pastor Wilson nodded and said, "Those are valid questions, and only you can answer them. But I'll tell you this, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness doesn't mean there are no consequences. Forgiveness means choosing not to let the hurt and anger consume you. It means releasing the bitterness so you can move forward, whether that's with James or without him. That's your choice." I left Pastor Wilson's office feeling slightly better, not healed, not ready to forgive, but at least feeling like I had some direction. I went home and started going through our finances, looking at bank statements, credit card bills, trying to see if there were other signs of infidelity that I'd missed. Were there unexplained charges? Were there withdrawals I couldn't account for? Were there other secrets James had kept? And to my surprise, everything looked normal. There were no suspicious charges, no secret accounts, no evidence of a prolonged affair. Just that one night, that one terrible mistake that had produced a baby. Over the next few days, I started to do something I probably shouldn't have. I started investigating Nicole. I searched social media for women named Nicole in Atlanta who might fit the description James had given me. And there were hundreds. But I went through them systematically, looking at profile pictures, looking for someone who looked like the baby, looking for some connection. And after hours of searching, I found her. Her name was Nicole Thompson. She was 34 years old. She worked as a waitress at the Blue Room, the bar where she and James had met. And her profile was mostly private, but her profile picture showed her holding a baby. The baby. The same big, dark eyes. The same little nose. And I felt this mix of emotions looking at her photo. Anger that this woman had slept with my husband, curiosity about who she was and why she'd left the baby, pity because whatever her situation was, it must have been desperate for her to abandon her child. I sent Nicole a message through social media, saying, "I'm Patricia Roberts, James's wife. Your daughter is safe. We're taking care of her. Please contact me. We need to talk." And then I waited. I checked my messages obsessively, every hour, hoping for a response. But days went by, and nothing. I sent follow-up messages. I tried calling the bar, asking for her, but they said she no longer worked there. She'd quit about a week ago, right around the time she'd left the baby on my porch. Meanwhile, James was staying with his brother Marcus and calling me every day, asking how I was, asking if we could talk, asking if there was any news about Nicole. And I gave him short answers. "I'm fine. No, we can't talk. No news." And then I'd hang up because I wasn't ready to have a real conversation with him. Wasn't ready to discuss our marriage or the baby or anything. I was still too hurt, too angry, too confused. About a week after the baby had been left on my porch, I finally got a response to my message from Nicole. She said, "Thank you for taking care of her. I'm sorry for leaving her like that, but I had no choice. I'm sick, really sick, and I can't take care of her anymore. I tried to contact James before, but I couldn't find him. I didn't know he was married. I didn't know about you. I just knew he needed to know about his daughter. Please take care of her. She deserves a good life." And I sat there staring at that message, feeling 1,000 different things. And I typed back, "What do you mean you're sick? What's wrong?" And she responded, "I have cancer, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say I have maybe a few months left. I have no family, no one who can take care of her. James is her only parent. That's why I left her with you. I didn't know what else to do." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This woman was dying, and she'd left her baby with us, with strangers essentially, because she had no other choice. And suddenly, the situation became so much more complicated, because this wasn't just about James's affair anymore. This was about a dying mother, desperate to ensure her child would be taken care of. This was about a baby who was about to become an orphan, who had no one in the world except James, and by extension, me. I called James immediately and told him about Nicole's message, and he was silent for a long time. And then he said, "My God, Patricia, that baby, she's going to lose her mother before she's even old enough to remember her." And I said, "I know, James, and we need to figure out what we're going to do, because that baby needs stability. She needs a home. She needs parents." And James said, "I'll take care of her, Patricia. I'll raise her. I know this isn't what you signed up for. I know you didn't ask for this, but she's my daughter, and I have to step up." And I said, "I know, James, but what about us? What about our marriage?" And he said, "Honestly, Patricia, I don't know. I hope you can forgive me. I hope we can work through this. But I understand if you can't. I understand if this is too much." I spent the next several days in a haze of confusion. I met with Nicole at a coffee shop she'd suggested, and seeing her in person made everything more real. She was thin, too thin, clearly sick, and she looked at me with these apologetic eyes and said, "I'm so sorry for what I did, for leaving the baby like that, for sleeping with your husband. I didn't know he was married. He didn't mention it. And by the time I found out, I was already pregnant, and I didn't know how to contact him." And I said, "Why didn't you tell him when you found out you were pregnant?" And she said, "I tried. I went back to the bar looking for him, but he'd never come back. I didn't know his last name, didn't know where he worked. I had no way of finding him until a few months ago when I saw him at a job site he was working on near my apartment. And I followed him and found out where he lived. And I realized he had a family, had a wife, had a life that didn't include me or our daughter." Nicole told me about her diagnosis, about how she'd been feeling sick during her pregnancy, but thought it was just pregnancy symptoms. And by the time she got checked, after the baby was born, the cancer had already spread and was untreatable. She told me she'd spent the last few months trying to figure out what to do, trying to find family or friends who could take the baby, but she had no one. Her parents were dead, she had no siblings, she'd been estranged from her extended family for years, and she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter going into foster care, going to strangers, when her father was alive and apparently stable with a family and a home. I should have hated Nicole. I should have blamed her for sleeping with my husband, for creating this situation. But sitting across from her, watching her struggle to breathe, watching her hands shake as she held her coffee cup, I couldn't hate her. She was a dying woman who'd made a mistake that had resulted in a beautiful baby girl who deserved better than to be collateral damage in an affair. She said, "I know I'm asking a lot. I know you don't owe me anything, but please take care of her, love her. Don't let her think she was unwanted or a mistake. She's the best thing that ever happened to me, even if I can't watch her grow up." I left that meeting with Nicole feeling completely overwhelmed. On one hand, I was still furious with James, still hurt by his betrayal, still unsure if I could forgive him or stay in our marriage. But on the other hand, there was this innocent baby who was about to lose her mother, who needed someone to step up, who needed stability and love and care. And James was her father, which meant, like it or not, this baby was connected to my family, to my children who were her half-siblings, to my future grandchildren who would be her nieces and nephews. I talked to Lorraine about it, and she said, "Patricia, nobody would blame you if you walked away from this, if you divorced James and let him figure out the baby situation on his own. But I know you, and I know you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to turn your back on a baby who needs help, even if that baby is evidence of your husband's infidelity." And I said, "I hate that you're right, Lorraine. I hate that I can't just walk away. I hate that I'm even considering helping with this situation. But you're right. I can't turn my back on her. She didn't ask for any of this." I called a family meeting with Marcus and Keisha. They both flew home, and we sat in my living room, the four of us, James, me, and our two adult children. And I said, "Okay, we need to talk about what we're going to do. James's daughter needs a home. Her mother is dying, and we're the only family she has. So we need to figure this out." Marcus spoke first and said, "Mom, I support whatever you decide, but I want to be clear that I'm furious with Dad. What he did was unforgivable, and if you want to divorce him, nobody would blame you. But if you want to try to work things out, if you want to help with the baby, I'll support that too." Keisha was less diplomatic. She looked at James with tears in her eyes and said, "Dad, how could you? How could you cheat on Mom? How could you lie to us? How could you create this situation and not tell anyone?" And James just shook his head and said, "I can't explain it, Keisha. There's no excuse for what I did. I was weak. I was stupid. I made a choice that I've regretted every single day since. And now we're all paying for it. And all I can do is try to make it right. Try to be the father this baby deserves. And try to earn back your trust, even if it takes the rest of my life." We talked for hours about logistics, about what it would mean to take in James's daughter, about whether James and I would stay together or separate, about how we'd explain this to extended family and friends. And by the end of the conversation, we'd reached a tentative plan. James would take custody of the baby. I would allow him to move back into the house, but we'd sleep in separate bedrooms. We'd work on our marriage through counseling, but there were no guarantees. I wasn't promising forgiveness or reconciliation, just the willingness to try to see if we could rebuild what had been broken. Nicole passed away 6 weeks after leaving her daughter on my porch. She'd been right that she didn't have much time left. And in those final weeks, James and I went to visit her several times, so she could see her daughter, could hold her, could say goodbye. And watching Nicole with that baby was heartbreaking. She'd sing to her and cry and tell her how much she loved her and how sorry she was that she couldn't stay. And I found myself comforting Nicole in those final moments, holding her hand while she cried, telling her that we'd take care of her daughter, that she'd be loved and safe. And Nicole looked at me with gratitude and said, "Thank you, Patricia. I know I don't deserve your kindness. I know what I did was wrong, but thank you for being a better person than I ever was." And I said, "We're all just trying to do our best, Nicole. We all make mistakes. And you're making sure your daughter has a future. That's what matters now." Nicole died on a Tuesday morning in hospice with James and me by her side. She'd asked us to be there, said she didn't want to die alone, and in her final moments, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Take care of my baby girl." And I promised her I would. And then she was gone. And James cried harder than I'd ever seen him cry. Not because he loved Nicole, I don't think he did, but because this woman who he'd spent one night with had died, leaving behind a child that he was now responsible for, leaving behind a situation that would change all our lives forever. The funeral was small, just James and me and a few people from the hospice and Nicole's former workplace, and afterward, we took the baby. I'd been calling her the baby for weeks because it felt wrong to use her given name, which Nicole had told us was Alana Marie Thompson. But after Nicole died, after we became her legal guardians through the process Nicole had set up before her death, Alana became ours, became part of our family. And I had to start thinking of her not as evidence of James's affair, but as a child who needed us. James and I started marriage counseling with a therapist named Dr. Henderson, who specialized in infidelity and rebuilding trust. And those sessions were brutal. James had to confront the reality of what he'd done, had to hear me express all the pain and anger and betrayal I'd been holding inside, and I had to confront my own feelings, had to decide whether I could forgive, whether I wanted to stay married, whether I could look at James every day and not see his betrayal. Dr. Henderson asked me what I needed to move forward, and I said, honestly, I don't know if I can move forward. I look at James and I see a stranger. I see someone who lied to me, who broke our vows, who created a child with another woman and kept it secret. I don't know if I can ever trust him again. And James said, "I understand, Patricia. And if you decide you can't, if you decide you want a divorce, I'll accept that. I'll understand. But I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be better, to show you that this was a mistake, not a pattern, to earn back your trust, even if it takes years." We decided to try to work on it, not because I'd forgiven James, but because I wasn't ready to give up on 27 years of marriage without trying everything possible to save it. And, more practically, because Alana needed stability, needed a home with two parents who could work together, even if they weren't romantically involved. And so we fell into this strange new normal, James living in the guest room, me in our bedroom, and Alana in what used to be Marcus's old room, converted into a nursery. Taking care of Alana was harder than I expected. Not physically. I'd raised two kids. I knew how to change diapers and make bottles and soothe a crying baby. But emotionally, every time I looked at her, I saw James's betrayal, saw evidence of the night he'd cheated, saw proof that my marriage hadn't been what I thought it was. But I also saw an innocent child who lost her mother, who had no one else, who needed love and care. And I couldn't punish her for her father's mistakes, couldn't let my anger at James affect how I treated her. My children struggled with the situation too. Marcus tried to be supportive, but I could tell he was uncomfortable around Alana, uncomfortable with what she represented. Keisha, on the other hand, bonded with her immediately, would come over several times a week to help with feedings and diaper changes and play with her. And she'd say, "Mom, I know this is hard, but look at her. She's so sweet. She's so innocent. This isn't her fault." And I'd say, "I know, honey. I know it's not her fault. but it's still hard. Our extended family had mixed reactions. My mother, who was 78 and still sharp as ever, said, "Patricia, you're a saint for taking in that child. But if it were me, I'd have kicked James out and let him figure it out himself." James's brother, Marcus, who he'd been staying with before moving back home, said, "James, you're an idiot. You almost destroyed your family for one night with a stranger, and now you have to live with the consequences every single day." Our friends from church were divided. Some thought we were doing the right thing, taking in Alana. Others thought I was being too forgiving, thought James should face harsher consequences. About 3 months after Nicole died, something shifted. I was feeding Alana late one night. She'd woken up crying, and I'd gotten up to take care of her. And as I sat in the rocking chair in her nursery giving her a bottle, I looked down at her little face, and I realized she was smiling at me. A real smile, not just gas like people say newborns do, but a genuine smile of recognition and contentment. And something in my heart softened, because this baby hadn't asked to be born, hadn't asked to be part of this complicated, messy situation. But here she was, and she was ours, and she deserved to be loved completely, without reservation, without resentment. I called Dr. Henderson the next day and said, "I think I'm ready to really try to forgive James, not for his sake, but for mine and for Alana's, because I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of looking at this baby and seeing betrayal instead of seeing a child who needs me." And Dr. Henderson said, "Patricia, that's a huge step. Forgiveness is a process, not a single moment, but recognizing that you're ready to start that process is important." James and I started slowly, trying to rebuild our marriage. We went on dates, awkward at first, because we hadn't been alone together without tension in months. We talked, really talked about what had happened, about why he'd made the choice he'd made, about what was broken in our marriage that had made him vulnerable to temptation. James said, "It wasn't anything you did, Patricia. It was all me. I'd been feeling old, been questioning whether I still had it, whether I was still attractive. And when Nicole paid attention to me, when she flirted with me, it felt good. And I made a terrible choice because of my own insecurity and ego." I said, "James, if you were feeling that way, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you needed validation or attention? Why go to a bar and confide in a stranger?" And he said, "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought it made me weak to admit I needed reassurance. And so I kept it inside. And then I made the worst decision of my life." And I said, "Well, you can't do that, James. If we're going to make this work, you have to talk to me about what you're feeling, even if it's hard, even if it's uncomfortable." And he said, "I know, Patricia, I know. And I'm committed to being honest from now on." About 6 months into our counseling, Dr. Henderson asked me if I'd forgiven James, and I thought about it, really thought about it, and I said, "I don't know if I've completely forgiven him, but I've let go of most of the anger. I understand he made a mistake. I understand he's human and flawed, just like I am, and I can see he's genuinely remorseful, genuinely trying to be better, and that has to count for something." And Dr. Henderson said, "That's forgiveness, Patricia. It's not forgetting what happened. It's not pretending it didn't hurt, but it's choosing to move forward, choosing to see your husband as more than just his worst mistake." Around Alana's first birthday, we had a small party, just our immediate family and a few close friends. And watching James with her, watching how gentle he was, how patient, how devoted, I saw a side of him I hadn't seen in years. He'd been a good father to Marcus and Keisha, but with Alana, there was this extra tenderness. Maybe because he knew what she'd lost, maybe because he felt guilty, maybe because he was trying to make up for his mistakes, but whatever the reason, he was fully present with her in a way that touched me. After the party, after everyone had gone home and Alana was asleep in her crib, James and I sat on the back porch with glasses of wine, and he said, "Patricia, I want to say something, and I want you to really hear me. I know what I did was unforgivable. I know I broke your trust in the worst possible way. And I know you didn't have to give me a second chance. You could have left. You could have made me raise Alana on my own. You could have burned my whole life down, and nobody would have blamed you. But you didn't. You stayed. You tried. You opened your heart to a child who wasn't yours, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that, being worthy of that. I looked at my husband, this man who'd hurt me so deeply, but who was trying so hard to make things right. And I said, James, I'm not going to lie and say everything's perfect. I'm not going to say I trust you completely or that I've forgotten what happened, but I can say I'm committed to our marriage. I'm committed to our family, including Alana, and I believe you when you say you'll never betray me again. And he reached over and took my hand and said, Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for giving me another chance. And we sat there holding hands, watching the sunset, and for the first time in over a year, I felt something like peace. Alana is 3 years old now, and she's a bright, funny, loving little girl who calls me Mama and James Daddy. She doesn't remember Nicole, doesn't remember being left on our porch, doesn't know yet about the complicated circumstances of her birth. We'll tell her someday when she's old enough to understand. But for now, she's just our daughter, Marcus and Keisha's little sister, our family's unexpected blessing. And I can honestly say I love her completely. Not in spite of where she came from, but because of who she is. My marriage to James is different now. We're more honest with each other, more vulnerable, more willing to address problems before they become crises. We still go to counseling once a month as a check-in, as a way to make sure we're staying connected. And while I won't say I never think about his affair, I will say it doesn't define our relationship anymore. It's part of our history, something we survived, something that ultimately made us stronger, even though I never would have chosen to go through it. I've learned a lot about forgiveness in the past 3 years. I've learned it's not a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. I've learned it doesn't mean forgetting or minimizing the hurt. It means choosing not to let that hurt control your life. I've learned that people are capable of terrible mistakes, but also of genuine change and growth. And I've learned that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the right thing. Taking in Alana was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it was also the right one, because she deserved a family, deserved love, deserved a chance at a good life, regardless of how she came into this world. People ask me sometimes how I did it, how I stayed with James, how I raised his daughter from an affair. And I tell them honestly, I don't know if I could do it again, if I'd be strong enough or forgiving enough if the circumstances were different. But in this specific situation, with this specific child who'd lost her mother, who had no one else, I couldn't walk away. My conscience wouldn't let me. And while it was hard, while there were days I wanted to give up, wanted to walk away, wanted to make James deal with everything alone, I'm glad I stayed. Because Alana brought something unexpected into our lives. She brought joy and laughter, and a reminder that even in the worst situations, even in the aftermath of betrayal, there can be healing and new beginnings. James is a different man now, more present, more engaged, more openly appreciative of our family. He tells me every day that he loves me, that he's grateful for me, that he doesn't deserve me. And while that used to make me angry, used to feel like he was trying to diminish what he'd done, now it just makes me feel seen and valued. He goes out of his way to show me he's committed, brings me flowers for no reason, plans date nights, takes over with Alana so I can have time to myself. And slowly, over time, these small, consistent acts of love and devotion have rebuilt the trust that was shattered that Saturday morning. My sister Lorraine, who was there through the worst of it, told me recently that she's proud of me, that she doesn't think she could have done what I did, that most people wouldn't have. And I said, Lorraine, I'm not special. I'm not some saint. I'm just a woman who decided that anger and bitterness were heavier burdens than forgiveness, that holding on to hurt was more exhausting than letting it go, and that this innocent child deserved better than to be treated as evidence of her father's mistakes. Our church community has been supportive too. Pastor Wilson checks in with us regularly, and he's told other couples our story as an example of how marriages can survive even the worst betrayals, how forgiveness is possible even when it seems impossible, how families can be blended and rebuilt even in the most unconventional circumstances. And while I'm not sure I want to be the poster child for forgiving infidelity, I do think our story matters because it shows that there's no one right way to handle these situations, that every family has to figure out what works for them. Marcus and Keisha have both said that watching James and me work through this has taught them important lessons about marriage, about forgiveness, about what it means to be committed to someone for better or worse. Marcus told me that he used to think if his future wife ever cheated on him, he'd leave immediately, no questions asked. But seeing what we went through, seeing how hard we worked to rebuild, seeing how much James has changed, has made him realize that relationships are more complicated than that people are more complicated than that, and that sometimes the harder choice is also the more rewarding one. Keisha said she's learned that love isn't just a feeling, it's a series of choices you make every day, choosing to stay, choosing to forgive, choosing to see the best in someone even when they've shown you their worst. And she said, Mom, watching you with Alana, watching you love her, even though she represents Dad's biggest mistake, that's taught me more about what real love looks like than anything else could have. Now, at 55 years old, with a 3-year-old daughter, which wasn't something I ever expected, I look back on that Saturday morning when I found Alana on my porch, and I see it differently. Then, it felt like my world was ending, like everything I believed about my marriage was a lie, like my life was falling apart. But now, I see it as a beginning, the beginning of a journey toward deeper forgiveness, more authentic communication, a stronger, more honest marriage, and the beginning of my relationship with Alana, who has brought so much unexpected joy into my life. I won't lie and say it was easy. It wasn't. There were days I wanted to give up, days I resented James, days I looked at Alana and felt nothing but pain, days I wondered if I was making a huge mistake staying in a marriage that had been betrayed. But I kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept choosing forgiveness over bitterness. And slowly, things got better. The pain lessened, the resentment faded, and I started to see my family not as broken, but as blended, not as damaged, but as different. To anyone out there who's facing a similar situation, who's discovered a betrayal, who's trying to decide whether to stay or go, whether to forgive or hold on to anger, I want you to know that there's no wrong answer. Some marriages can't survive infidelity, shouldn't survive it, and walking away is sometimes the healthiest choice. But if you decide to stay, if you decide to try to rebuild, know that it's possible, that with work and time and commitment and genuine remorse from the person who hurt you, it is possible to create something new, something maybe even stronger than what you had before. The note that came with Alana said, "Ask your husband," and I did. And what I learned changed everything, but not in the way I expected. Yes, I learned that James had cheated, that he'd kept a terrible secret, that our marriage had been built partially on deception. But I also learned that I was stronger than I thought, that I was capable of forgiveness, even when it seemed impossible, that I could love a child who wasn't mine, that I could rebuild trust even after it had been shattered. And those lessons have been worth all the pain, all the struggle, all the hard work of the past 3 years. My marriage isn't perfect. No marriage is. But it's honest, and it's real, and it's built on a foundation of genuine remorse, genuine forgiveness, and genuine commitment to being better to each other and to our family. James made a terrible mistake, one that had lasting consequences. But he's spent every day since trying to make it right. And I've spent every day choosing to let him, to see him as more than his worst moment, to build a future instead of dwelling in the past. And Alana? Well, she's the unexpected gift in all of this, the silver lining in a very dark cloud. She didn't ask to be part of this complicated family, but she's thriving. She's loved. She's happy. And watching her grow, watching her personality emerge, watching her bond with her siblings and extended family has brought healing that I didn't know was possible. Someone left a baby on my porch with a note saying, "Ask your husband." And in that moment, I realized my entire marriage was built partially on a lie. But what I've learned in the years since is that marriages are built and rebuilt over and over throughout a lifetime. That one lie doesn't negate 27 years of truth. That one mistake doesn't erase decades of love and commitment. And that sometimes the most broken situations can be transformed into something beautiful if you're willing to do the hard work of forgiveness and rebuilding. My name is Patricia. I'm 55 years old, and my husband's daughter from an affair was left on my porch 3 years ago. And I survived it. More than survived it. I found a strength I didn't know I had, a capacity for forgiveness that surprised me, and a love for a child who wasn't mine that has enriched my life in ways I never expected. And if I can do it, if I can take the worst betrayal of my life and transform it into something that ultimately made me stronger, made my marriage stronger, made my family stronger, then anyone can. There's always hope. There's always the possibility of redemption. There's always a chance to choose love over anger, forgiveness over bitterness, healing over hurt. And that choice, that daily choice to move forward instead of staying stuck in pain, that's what has made all the difference.